As a deep-sea diver, I discovered the impossible. An entire 19th century town. I thought it was a ghost town, a silent memorial. Then I realized the residents never left. My name is Jack, and the deep is my cathedral. For 20 years, I've been a wreck diver, drawn to the silent, drowned histories of ships lost to storms and time. But what I found was no shipwreck. It was during a deep-water geological survey. Off the coast, mapping a previously uncharted cave system. The passage was narrow and treacherous, but my submersibles sonar painted a picture of a vast, open space beyond. When I broke through, my lights cut through the abyssal dark and landed on something impossible. It was a building, a perfectly preserved two-story general store, complete with a wooden porch and glass windows. I maneuvered the sub, my heart pounding against my ribs. It was not just a building, it was a town. An entire, perfectly preserved 19th century town, nestled in the heart of a colossal underwater cavern. A church with its steeple intact, small houses with picket fences, a blacksmith shop with an anvil still visible through the doorway. The water was preternaturally clear and still, untouched by currents. It was a perfect, silent photograph of a world that should have vanished a century ago. But this photograph was empty. The only thing missing from the impossible, pristine town of Stillwater were the people. I tethered the sub and exited into the crushing silence, my movements slow and deliberate in the heavy water. My helmet light cut a sharp, white cone through the perfect darkness. I walked down what must have been Main Street, my magnetic boots clanking with an obscene loudness in this silent world. There was no decay, no dust, no sediment, no marine growth. It was as if the town had been sealed in a vacuum a moment after its inhabitants vanished. I chose a small two-story house, pushing open a door that swung on its hinges with a silence that defied all logic. The interior was a perfect tableau. A half-eaten meal sat on the dining room table. A child's doll lay on the floor. It was in the dining room that I found them, the family. They were not skeletons, they were statues. A man, a woman, and two children, all seated at the table, rendered in a material that looked like pale veined marble. The detail was flawless, capturing the fold of a sleeve, the stray curl of a little girl's hair, the faint smile on the mother's face as she looked at her husband. It was a beautiful, horrifying memorial. I backed away slowly, my breath fogging. The inside of my helmet, my light swept across the scene one last time as I turned to leave, and then I froze. The mother, the statue of the mother. I could have sworn that a moment ago she was smiling at her husband. Her gaze was no longer fixed on her husband. It was fixed with a cold, solid permanence on me. A tidal wave of primal fear, cold and crushing as the deep itself washed over. Me, my training, my years of discipline, evaporated into a cloud of frantic bubbles. I scrambled backwards, the obscene clank of my boots echoing through the house. My helmet light danced erratically, cutting across the room. The little boy at the table, who had been staring at his plate, was now looking towards the doorway. Towards me, the father's hand, once resting on the table, was now gripping its edge, his marble knuckles white. This was not a memorial, it was a nest. The stillness was not death, it was patience. A horrifying thought bloomed in my mind. They were not frozen in time, they were frozen in weight, and my presence, my light, my gaze was the warmth that had begun to thaw them. I turned and fled, bursting out of the house and into the silent street. As I ran, a silent, synchronized pivot was happening all around me. The blacksmith in his shop, the woman peering from a window, the preacher standing at his pulpit visible through the church doors. Every single statue in the town of Stillwater was slowly, silently turning. They turned not to chase me, but simply to watch me, a unified town-wide audience following my desperate, panicked flight. I reached the sub, my hands fumbling with the hatch, my breath a high, thin whine of escaping air. I slammed it shut, sealing myself in. As the sub's systems whirred to life, I swung its powerful external lights back towards the town for one last look, and what I saw will be burned into my memory forever. The entire population of Stillwater had walked from their homes and businesses. They were gathered at the edge of the cavern, a silent, pale army of marble figures, watching me. But in the very center of the crowd, facing me, was an empty space. A space that was exactly the size of a single person. The town of Stillwater was not a grave, it was a gallery, and it was waiting for its newest acquisition. My 7-year-old son told me another boy who looked exactly like him lived under his bed. I told him it was just his imagination. But now, when I hear footsteps in his room at night, I have to ask myself, which one is it? It began, as these things so often do, with a child's simple, impossible statement. My 7-year-old son, Leo, looked up from his dinner, his expression not one of fear, but of casual fact. "The other me lives under my bed," he said. "My wife, Sarah." And I exchanged the look that all parents share, a silent negotiation of who would handle this particular brand of childhood fantasy. I took the lead, smiling. "Oh yeah, and what's this other you like?" Leo pushed a pea around his plate with his fork. "He's just like me," he said, "but quiet." We chalked it up to an imaginary friend, a common coping mechanism after our recent move. We played along, asking the usual questions. Is he nice? Does he have a name? Leo just shrugged. He doesn't need a name. He's just ... the other me. He only comes out when it's dark, when everyone is asleep. That night, during our usual bedtime ritual, I made a show of checking under his bed. I knelt down, lifted the dusty fabric of the bed skirt, and looked into the dark void. "Nope, all clear," I announced cheerfully. "No other Leos under here." As I stood up, Leo looked at me with a patience that seemed far too old for his years. "Of course, he's not there now, Dad," he said, his voice a soft whisper. "You're awake." For the next few weeks, the other me became a quiet fixture in our lives. We'd ask Leo how his silent roommate was doing, and he'd give us a simple, one-word answer. It was a joke, a family quirk. Until the morning Sarah came downstairs, her face pale. She was holding one of Leo's sneakers. "Where did he learn this?" she asked, her voice hushed. I looked at the shoe. The lace was tied in a perfect, impossibly intricate knot, a complex series of loops and turns that looked like something a seasoned sailor would tie. I knew for a fact that Leo could barely manage a standard bunny ear loop. At breakfast, we asked him. Leo didn't even look up from his cereal. "The other me taught me," he said, as if explaining that 2 + 2 = 4. "He does it in the dark. It's easy when you can see." That night, I put Leo to bed with a gnawing sense of anxiety. I placed his usual glass of water on his nightstand and kissed his forehead. As I was leaving the room, he spoke, his voice soft in the darkness. "Sometimes he's thirsty too." The simple statement sent a shiver down my spine. Later, around midnight, driven by a need I couldn't explain, I crept back to his room and pushed the door open a silent crack. The room was still, bathed in the faint, the blue glow of his nightlight. I could see the small lump of his body under the covers, but my eyes were drawn to the nightstand. There, sitting perfectly beside the full glass of water I had left, was a second, identical glass, half empty. It hadn't been there before. I knew, with a certainty that made my blood run cold, that no one in this house had put it there. The next morning, the perfect, silent child came downstairs. The being that looked like my son sat at the table and finished a complex puzzle from a set he'd gotten for his birthday. A puzzle he had thrown a tantrum over just days before because it was too difficult. He placed the final piece without a moment's hesitation, his movements economical and precise. Sarah and I watched from the kitchen doorway, a silent, shared terror passing between us. The child in our dining room was an uncanny imitation, a flawless forgery. He had Leo's face, Leo's voice, but he was hollow. That afternoon, I sat down opposite him. I had to know. "Leo," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "Remember our trip to the beach last year, when we found that big, blue crab? What was the secret name we gave him?" I held my breath. It was a stupid, meaningless detail, a secret shared between a father and son on a sunny afternoon. It was the kind of memory that couldn't be taught or copied. The boy looked at me, his head tilting slightly. His expression was not one of confusion, but of calm, placid consideration. After a long, terrible silence, he gave me a small, empty smile. "He didn't tell me that part," he said, and in that moment, I understood. The thing sitting across from me wasn't my son. It was the thing. My son now told his stories too, in the dark, from a place where I could no longer reach him. My job as an archivist is to preserve the past. I found a box of old photographic plates from a forgotten farm. But as I developed them, I realized I wasn't just looking at a family's history. I was watching a hunt. And the man in the background was getting closer with every picture. My name is Arthur Penn, and I am an archivist. My world is one of quiet dust, the smell of decaying paper, and the patient cataloging of forgotten lives. The box arrived as part of a miscellaneous estate donation, unmarked and unassuming. Inside, nestled in yellowed straw, were 24 glass photographic plates, heavy and cold to the touch. The label simply read The Miller Farm, 1888. It was my job to preserve these fragile windows to the past. In the dim, red light of the university's dark room, I began the delicate process of bringing them back to life. The first image bloomed into existence in the chemical bath, a ghostly portrait of a stern, hard-working family posing in front of a simple farmhouse. A father, a mother, and 3 children, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on a point beyond the camera. As I examined the finished print, I noticed a tiny flaw at the far edge of the frame, a dark, vertical smudge near the distant tree line. I dismissed it as a scratch in the emulsion. Then I developed the second plate. It was a photo of the father and his eldest son mending a fence. They were closer to the house now, and the smudge from the first photo was also closer. It was no longer a flaw. It was the distinct silhouette of a tall, impossibly thin man in dark, formal attire, standing perfectly still, watching them from the edge of the field. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I carefully placed the second print on the drying line and reached for the next glass plate, my professional detachment giving way to a morbid, pressing urgency. The third photo bloomed into view, the mother hanging laundry on a line, her face turned away from the camera. Over her shoulder, just at the line of the fence, the tall man stood, a motionless sentinel of dread. Plate after plate, I worked with a frantic, obsessive energy. With every image, the story grew darker. The Miller family's expressions shifted from stern sobriety to a gaunt, hunted wariness. And in every single photograph, the tall man was there, relentlessly closer. He moved from the fence line to the middle of the yard. He stood behind the children as they played by the well, a dark pillar of wrongness in the summer sun. He was never looking at them. He was always looking directly at the camera, at the person taking the photograph, at me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, unsteady rhythm. The acrid smell of the developer felt thick and suffocating. I reached for the final plate in the box. My hands, which had been so steady, now had a slight tremor. I slid the cold glass into the chemical bath, my eyes locked on the ghostly image as it began to resolve. This photo was different. It was a shot of the farmhouse itself, taken from the yard. The family was nowhere to be seen, but the tall man was there. He was standing on the porch, his featureless head tilted slightly as if listening. He had reached the house. My breath hitched, a dry, rasping sound in the unnatural quiet of the darkroom. My hands were slick with a mixture of sweat and chemicals. There was one plate left. I told myself to stop, to take the box of cursed glass and seal it away, to leave this forgotten family to their grim fate. But I could not. The archivist in me, the part that craves conclusion, was a stronger force than my fear. I slid the final plate into the developer, the red light casting a hellish glow on the rippling liquid. I watched, mesmerized, as the image began to resolve. But it was not the Miller farm. It was not the porch, not a field, not a barn. I saw the faint outline of shelves laden with chemical bottles. I saw a drying line with small, rectangular prints hanging from it. I saw the unmistakable shape of an enlarger in the corner. I was looking at a photograph of the darkroom I was standing in. My mind reeled, struggling to comprehend the impossibility. Then, the final details sharpened into focus. I could see a figure in the photograph, a man leaning over a developer tray, his back to the camera. It was me, and standing directly behind the image of myself, cloaked in the deepest shadows of the room, was the tall, thin man. A gasp escaped my lips, and I stumbled back, dropping the cold, wet plate into the tray with a splash. It was then that I heard it, a sound from behind me in the real world. The soft, deliberate click of the darkroom's heavy bolt sliding into place. For 6 months, I had the same dream of an endless white hallway. Last night, for the first time, a door appeared. I was foolish enough to open it. Now that I'm awake, I've realized something came back with me. For the past 6 months, I have had the same dream. It is not a nightmare, not in the traditional sense. It is sterile, calm, and predictable. I am standing at the beginning of a hallway. The walls, floor, and ceiling are a seamless, brilliant white, lit by an unseen, shadowless light source. The hallway is infinitely long. My only task is to walk. There is no sound but the faint, soft padding of my own bare feet on the smooth floor. And so I walk, for what feels like hours, a serene, pointless journey through a landscape of pure white. I never feel tired. I never feel fear. I only feel a strange sense of purpose, a quiet compulsion to continue down the endless corridor. But last night, something changed. For the first time in 6 months, there was something new in the white expanse. About 100 paces ahead of me, a single, plain, dark wooden door had appeared, set flush into the right-hand wall. It had no handle, no lock, just a simple, dark rectangle in the endless white. The dream had never varied, not once. The appearance of the door felt like a monumental event, a shift in the very fabric of my subconscious world. My pace quickened. The serene purpose I usually felt was replaced by a new feeling, something I hadn't experienced in this place before. Curiosity. I reached the door, its dark wood a stark contrast to the brilliant white. I hesitated for only a moment before placing my hand against it. The wood was cool and smooth. I pushed. The door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing not a room, but a wall of absolute, impenetrable blackness. An empty void. I stood on the threshold between the infinite white and the total black. And then I woke up. I woke up with a gasp, my heart pounding. The image of the open door burned into my mind. I sat up, drenched in a cold sweat, but my apartment was just as it had always been. The familiar comfort of my own space slowly calmed the frantic beating of my heart. I dismissed it as a simple evolution of the dream. I got up, showered, and got dressed for work. But as I stood in my kitchen, making coffee, I felt the first faint, dissonant note. The blue coffee mug, my favorite one, the one I used every single morning, was not in its usual spot on the first shelf. It was on the second shelf, behind the plates. I frowned. I am a creature of habit. I never put it there. I shrugged it off, thinking I must have been more tired than I realized the night before. But the small inconsistencies continued. At work, a file I was certain I had left on the left side of my desk was on the right. The password to my computer, which I had typed 1,000 times, was suddenly rejected. I had to reset it, my fingers fumbling with a sense of growing unease. These were tiny, insignificant details, the kind of things you would normally forget in an instant, but they were accumulating. My green jacket was missing from its hook by the door. A book I was reading was back on the shelf, a bookmark placed 20 pages before where I had stopped. It felt as if a quiet, invisible hand was moving through my life, subtly editing the details, rearranging the set dressing of my reality. My apartment, my office, the places that were most familiar to me, suddenly felt alien, like a convincing but slightly inaccurate replica of the world I knew. I tried to reason with myself, blaming stress, lack of sleep, but a cold, terrifying thought began to creep into my mind, a thought that I could not dismiss. I had not just woken up from the dream of the hallway when I pushed open that door. Into the blackness, I had let something out, and now it was here in my world, making small, quiet, curious adjustments. That night, I didn't want to sleep. I fought it, pacing my subtly wrong apartment, drinking coffee until my hands shook. But exhaustion is an inevitable tide. I collapsed into bed, and instantly I was back in the white hallway. This time, however, it was not empty. The dark, wooden door was gone. In its place, scattered along the smooth white floor, were the objects from my life. My blue coffee mug, the missing green jacket, the book I was reading, lying open to the wrong page. They were like exhibits, artifacts, placed for careful study, I walked past them, a tourist in the museum of my own unraveling life. I kept walking until I saw the final exhibit. It was a perfect replica of my own apartment door, standing alone in the infinite white, and next to the door stood a figure. It was not human. It was a tall, wavering column of fractured light, a being of impossible geometry that my mind could not properly comprehend. It did not speak, but a thought bloomed in my mind, clean and cold as the hallway itself. The variables had been catalogued. The simulation was a success. Thank you for your cooperation. A wave of understanding, so profound it felt like a physical blow, crashed over me. My life, my world, my memories, they were not real. They were a testing ground, a sandbox for this thing to practice in. I screamed, a silent, desperate scream that had no sound in that white place. And then I woke up, the morning light streaming through my window. Everything in my room was back to normal. The mug was on its shelf. My jacket was on its hook. For a dizzying moment, I thought it was over. Then I looked out the window. The sky was a shade of blue I had never seen before, a deep, synthetic, perfect cobalt. And across it, two identical suns were beginning to rise. My test was over. The primary simulation had just begun. The deed to my new house had one strange rule: never open the small iron door in the cellar. For 7 years, I resisted. Yesterday, I finally broke the lock. This morning, I discovered that now every other door and window in my house is sealed shut. I bought the house for a steal. It was an old Victorian, a forgotten relic on the edge of town, priced so low it felt like a clerical error. The realtor, a nervous man with shifting eyes, explained the single, bizarre condition of the sale. The previous owner was eccentric, he'd said, forcing a laugh. There's a door in the cellar, a small, iron-banded thing. The deed stipulates it is to remain locked. Always, as long as you own the house, you never, ever open it. It was a ridiculous clause, but for a house this size at this price, I would have agreed to anything. For 7 years, I kept that promise. The cellar door became a running joke. I'd show it to friends, tapping the heavy, rusted padlock with a theatrical flourish. It was a curiosity, a piece of the house's strange history. But the thought of it festered in the back of my mind. What could possibly be so important that a man would write it into the legal deed of his own home? My curiosity grew from a whisper to a roar, a constant nagging pressure. One rainy Tuesday, the pressure became too much. I went to the cellar, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and time. I took a heavy pair of bolt cutters from my workshop. With a single, loud, metallic snap, the old padlock broke. The promise was broken. I pulled the heavy iron handle, and the door swung inward with a deep, groaning complaint. I aimed my flashlight into the darkness beyond, and I saw nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was a small, stone-lined closet, empty save for a few cobwebs and a thick layer of dust. I let out a long, slow breath, a mixture of disappointment and relief. I had broken a sacred vow for an empty room. I laughed at my own foolishness, closed the door, and went to bed. I woke the next morning feeling lighter, the nagging 7-year question finally answered. The absurdity of it all made me smile as I walked into the kitchen for coffee. I went to the back door to let some fresh air in, but the deadbolt wouldn't turn. It was stuck fast, as if it had been welded into place. I frowned, chalking it up to the damp weather making the old wood swell. I tried the front door. The handle turned, the latch clicked, but the door itself wouldn't budge, hitting the frame with a solid, unmoving thud. A prickle of unease started at the base of my neck. I went from window to window, trying each one. The living room window, the kitchen window, the small one in the bathroom, none of them would open. They were sealed as tightly as if they were part of the wall itself. Panic began to bubble in my chest, hot and sharp. I raced back down to the cellar, my heart hammering against my ribs. The small iron-banded door stood just as I had left it. I grabbed the handle and pulled. It swung open easily, but the small, empty stone closet I had seen the night before was gone. In its place was a perfect, impossible mirror image of my own cellar, stretching back into darkness. I saw my workbench, my tools, my neatly stacked boxes, all reflected, with perfect fidelity. It was not a reflection. I could feel a faint, cool draft coming from the doorway. I had not opened a closet. I had opened a passage, and by closing it again, I had sealed something else. My house was no longer a home, it was a cage. I spent the next few hours in a frantic, desperate frenzy, throwing myself against the doors, trying to break the windows with a chair, but nothing would give. The house had become a seamless, impenetrable box. Defeated and trembling, I sank to the floor in the living room, my mind struggling to process the horrifying reality. The previous owner hadn't been eccentric. He had been a warden. He hadn't locked something in the cellar. He had locked the house out of whatever was on the other side of that door. By opening it, I hadn't let something into my house. I had connected my house to another place, and in doing so, had disconnected it from the world I knew. I sat there, for what could have been hours, listening to the silence of my prison. Then I heard it, a faint sound coming from the cellar. It was a soft, metallic click, the sound of the heavy, rusted padlock on the small iron-banded door being fastened shut from the other side. A wave of cold, absolute dread washed over me as I understood the final, terrible truth. I had not broken into an empty room. I had performed an exchange. And somewhere out in the real world, the world of sunshine and rain and open doors, another house, identical to mine, now sat in its place. A house that was empty, quiet, and waiting for its new owner. And I was trapped. Here, in the echo, the copy, the prison left behind. The house was the lock, and I had just become its key.